Alright, so here we go. Episode 3.
The beat as things I did 20 years ago. What I did 20 years ago is what they're doing tomorrow.
Alright, so this episode is going to be a pretty quick one. I don't have a lot of video or photos, unfortunately, of a lot of things I'm going to be going over today. And I'm also going to trip over my own tongue about 47,000 times. So let's just get right to that. First thing I did was I took the dashboard off the truck. Once I got that apart, what I did on this truck was I took all the climate control system, all the vents and ductwork out of the truck, washed them in warm soapy water, and went ahead and got those all dried out and cleaned. And then I replaced all the foam seals around all the junctions on it so that it sealed up real well. And that eliminated all the stinky stuff. You got to do that in the blower motor. You got to do that with the air conditioning exchanger box, and you got to do that with your the big box in the middle, which actually has all the flaps and everything to send stuff in different directions. I forget what they call that, but anyway, got all that taken care of. One thing about these Nissans is that all the bracketry that holds the dashboard and all the components up in the truck, all those metal brackets under the dash, those are bare metal from the factory. So you do tend to end up with some surface rust. I had a 91 that I did recently. I'm going to do another episode on that truck just to show you what I did on that one. I'll show you a picture of it here. Those brackets were really rusty, and I ended up having to dip them and strip them and do all kinds of stuff. These brackets were pretty decent. I was able to just kind of wire brush them all clean, get all the surface rust off them, and then I was able to use a primer coat, rust inhibited primer, and then I painted them all semi-gloss black. So when I put the truck all back together, I think I'll show you in these pictures, you'll notice that those brackets have all been painted, so I don't have to worry about surface rust anymore. Looks a lot cleaner, and like I said, I replaced all the foam and rubber and everything else in the climate control system, so I didn't have any funny smells or anything coming out of it when I turned on the heater or the air conditioner. Alright, so that takes care of the climate control section. Another thing I did is white face gauges. So I took out the instrument cluster. There was a crack in the lens, so I was able to get another lens from a junkyard. Luckily, when I lived there 7 years ago in California, you could go to like a pick your part type of wrecking yard, and there'd usually be 7 or 8 Nissans in there. So it was pretty easy to find the parts I needed used. So and I ended up with a donor truck that I picked up for next to nothing that had a lot of good stuff in it. So that helped. So anyway, I took the dash cluster apart, went ahead and put the white face gauges in it. Did that in stages. You'll notice in some of these pictures I've got like 60,000 miles, and in another picture I've got like 85,000 miles. I put like 25,000 miles on this truck in 2.5 years. Kind of crazy, but it was my daily driver. As a matter of fact, you'll notice in one of the pictures I've got the instrument cluster zip tied back into place with the dashboard missing because I had to drive the truck around like that. Alright, so one of the things I did while I had the dash cluster apart, or the instrument cluster apart, to install the white face gauges is I went ahead and repainted the needles. Here's a shot of a couple needles laying next to each other. The way to do this that I found works best, because it's not the first time I've done it, it's plastic, so you got to be careful. So what I did was I took some alcohol on a Q-tip rather than a paint thinner, and I just kind of lightly went over the existing paint to remove it from the back of the needle. It was dull and old, so that ended up with a nice clean clear needle, as you can see in the bottom of this picture, and the needle right above it's been repainted. Now what I used to repaint needles, in this case I used a color called fluorescent orange, and this is a Tester's model paint. It comes in the little tiny like 1.5 ounce bottles, and I just used that and a small paintbrush and just painted the needle again. It's a perfect color, I thought. They come in a million colors, so you can literally paint it any color you want. Alright, so once that was done, got the needles put back together, got them popped in with the white face gauges. I did that in 2 stages, and what you'll notice is I've got, at first I just put in the gauge faces themselves, and I didn't put in any of the other white components, and then later on I went ahead and added all the white parts back to the instrument cluster, where like the turn signals go and things like that, and all your warning lights. So once that was all put back together, I actually had to think about how I was going to put the LED lighting in the instrument cluster itself. I decided I wanted the LED lighting that I was installing in the truck to be able to have it on the instrument cluster and the climate controls in the middle of the truck, as well as in the dash vents, under the dash, in the amplifier rack, etc., etc. So you can see my first test, I just put some LEDs in front of the white face gauges so they would reflect off of them. And that just didn't really work out too well. It created too much light around the gauges, like against the bezel and whatnot, and it just it didn't make the gauges really clear to read, or it didn't look real professional either. It looked hokey and like somebody did it at home. So what I ended up doing after that was I went ahead and I put them in the gauge assembly itself, behind the white face gauges, and as you can see in these pictures, it worked out much, much better. Okay, so that was get the cluster. Now once I got the dashboard put back together, I don't know if I showed you this yet. If not, I'll show you again. So when I put the vents all back into the truck and put new foam on all of them, another thing I did was I went ahead and put LEDs in all the vents, and you can see in this picture all the orange and yellow wires coming out of the dash, those are all for the LEDs. And if you saw the episode 2 where I worked on the fuse panel, you saw I had 3 switches in the glove box. Well, that's what these switches did. The switches allow me to turn on the instrument cluster and the climate controls on one switch, and then I had the all the dash vents and under dash lighting and under seat lighting and all that on a second switch, and then I had the amp rack in the back, which will be the next episode. In the amp rack, I had another full perimeter of LEDs that was on the third switch. So they weren't all independently controlled as far as I couldn't have 3 different colors going in 3 different sections. I just had one controller controlling all the LEDs, but I was able to just turn on and off specific sections. So when I wanted to drive around at night, I could make my dash and my climate controls whatever color I wanted, and I didn't have my vents on and my amp rack or any of that, so it wasn't like a rolling circus driving down the freeway. And so, yeah, that's basically what I did. You'll notice also on the vents, I painted a lot of the vents white on the inside, and that was so that I would get a little more light from the LEDs. There was a few other things I needed to do to the dashboard too. Let me show you some wiring right here. You'll notice this, there's 3 butt connectors directly in line with each other. This was the ignition wiring harness coming directly off the ignition switch. And the car had had alarms put in it over multiple times before I got to it. People had installed stereos and tapped into things, and it was just a mess. I mean, look at it, it's a rat's nest. So I went ahead and fixed all that wiring. I solder all my stuff. I like doing good crimp connectors. You'll see. I'm going to do another video where I rewire an odometer gauge panel. You'll get a better look at the kind of wiring I do on that one. I went ahead and fixed that wiring, and I also tapped in 3 lines that would lead to the relays in the fuse panel in the glove box. Like I said, that was the only way I tapped into the truck, was just off of those. And then once I started putting the dash back together, another thing we needed to do was I actually kind of restored the climate control panel itself. The original one had been repainted at some point by somebody, and it was all sticky and goofy looking. You can see it in the photo here. Looked terrible. So what I did was I took it apart. It comes apart in 3 pieces. And I needed to take it apart anyway, because to get the LEDs into the climate control section, I had to remove the factory bulb, and then I had to take the clear diffuser that sits behind the actual light up panel, and I had to file that down, or grind it down I should say, and sand it to make it thin enough that I could fit the LEDs behind it and still have the diffuser there, because without the diffuser you could kind of see the individual LEDs and it didn't line up quite right. Some parts of it didn't light up and other parts were too bright. So by leaving the diffuser in it, it made it a lot more uniform when I lit it up. So ground that down, stuck the 2 LED strips behind it, which you can see in this photo here, and then put a notch in the side so I could run the wiring out directly into the glove box. So that's again what those little orange and green, or orange and yellow wires do. So anyway, we did that. By doing that, oh, and while I was doing that, I went ahead and I sanded down that bezel and painted it with a flat black, so that looked nice and fresh again. And I polished that little cover that shows, you know, the hot and the cold and all that. I polished that too because it had some light scratches on it. And so by the time I put that all back in, it looked brandy new. There's a picture of it installed. It's got some greasy fingerprints on it because I always test fit everything. If you guys wonder why some things look dirty when I'm putting them together, and then you see other shots where something I had previously installed isn't shown anymore, I test fit everything before I do any final assembly. I always have and I always will. So that brings us to the stereo head unit. Use the Kenwood head unit, and I put a 7-band Clarion EQ in it, an EQ 746 I want to say. So anyway, that's what we put in there. Now, me being the wackadoo that I am, I wasn't happy with the way the EQ lined up in the mounting plate. There was a mounting kit that I bought to put the stereo in, and so if you look in this photo, you'll see that the line on the side of the mounting area doesn't line up exactly with the end of the EQ. I'll throw an arrow on the picture so you know what I'm talking about. So again, me being a wacko, I went ahead and pulled the EQ out and I filed the ends down and sanded them down until they were lined up perfectly with that edge, and then I repainted the ends black and installed it so that it all lined up perfect. Just who I am. So anyway, that's another mod I did. Here's a shot of the wiring in the back, and I'm just showing you this because you'll notice that the factory radio plug isn't actually plugged into anything. When I said in the last video that I built my whole electrical system in the glove box separate from the vehicle, I did the same thing with the sound system. The stereo was not plugged into the factory harness at all. The speakers, none of it. So I had new speaker wires run for everything. I had new amp leads run. I had trigger wires run. The ignition source, like I said, I had wired in to relays in the glove box, so I ran it off of those relays to turn everything on. So that factory plug was just sitting there, and again, that was so if I ever wanted to go back to stock on the truck, I could take all my custom stuff out of it, put the truck back to stock basically in a day, and you know, have a stock vehicle. That pretty much finishes up what I did under the dash. Again, there was some more stuff I didn't really take any pictures of, some more wiring fixes and things like that that just aren't very glamorous, so there was no point in taking a picture. So once we got all that LED lighting done, we had the dashboard all put back together, we had our white face gauges in it and our needles repainted, and everything was smelling nice when you turned on the air conditioning. I went ahead and turned my attention to the last thing we're going to talk about in this episode, which is the seats. So, you gotta love drifters, because they're always buying a nice car and trashing it. I was able to get these seats for just a couple $100 for the pair, and they were really clean. They were black leather, and they were power. So it was nice to be able to put power seats in the truck. Can't remember if the passenger seat was power. I think just the driver's seat maybe. But anyway, they wouldn't fit in the truck because they're pretty big and pretty tall. And the way they sit on the floor, I couldn't get them to line up really well with the factory cross member that the factory seats were bolted into. So what I ended up doing, you can see, I don't think I have video of this, but I do have a photo of the new cross member sitting in place with a seat bracket bolted to it. And you can see the spot welds that I had cut to remove the factory cross member from the floor. So anyway, I cut out this cross member, and I just got a piece of box tubing, 1.5 inch I believe, or 2 inch by 2 inch square. And I cut that down to fit the contour of the floor, and tack welded that in all the way across to re-support the floorboard and give me a place to bolt the new seats to. The seats had to be mounted a lot lower than the factory seats because they're really thick cushion on the bottom. So I went and made up my own mounting tabs on the seats, welded them in. This was actually the first time I'd welded anything myself. I was just learning how to weld, so they're not the prettiest welds, they're not the best penetration, but they were definitely good enough from a structural standpoint. And for my first welding project, they came out pretty good, I think. So got new tabs made up and welded on there, got my new cross members bolted in, and that allowed me to get the seats in level and straight and where they needed to be, and have full range of motion front and back, and tilting in the whole nine. So here they are installed in the truck. They looked great. They felt so much nicer than the original seats. The original seats really messed with my back. I got kicked out of the Army with back problems. I get discharged, I should say, with back injury. And so those factory seats, those factory buckets were not friendly to my back whatsoever. And I had a lot of back pain getting out of that truck. So adding these seats was a big deal for me because they were a million times more comfortable, and I didn't get the fatigue or the pain in my back like I was getting from the old seats. So that was not only a nice upgrade from a look standpoint, but it was a huge upgrade for my back. So I guess that pretty much covers everything we did as far as those items go. Like I said, hopefully this was a short episode. We'll find out when I'm done. But next episode is when we're going to get into something a little more glamorous and a little more fun. That's going to be building the amp rack and the subwoofer enclosures and the speaker pods in the back of the truck for the stereo system. So stay tuned for that. Again, I appreciate you guys watching. Like I said before, I'm doing this because I've been doing this a long time, and hopefully I have something to offer to you younger guys who are just getting into it. Maybe a source of inspiration or information for you. So thanks again for watching. Helps me a lot if you subscribe. Don't have to, clearly. But hey, look forward to it. We'll see you on the next episode. Thanks again. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
The beats as things I did 20 years ago. What I did 20 years ago is what they're doing